Steven Holl has been called an architectural poet. His designs have a visceral quality that appeal to the senses through light, texture, and shape. His proposal for the American Memorial Library in Berlin has been called a modernist masterpiece. His 1988 book, Anchoring, is one of the best-selling architecture books of all time. Some of his recent projects include an expansion of the Cranbrook Institute of Science in Michigan and the Museum of Contemporary Art in Helsinki, which won Finland's highest design award. I am pleased, for those reasons and others, to have him on this broadcast. Welcome. At long last, it's great to have you here. Let me talk about you a little bit. Tell me a little bit about where you place yourself in the world of architecture. Because I was having a conversation with a friend of mine who writes about architecture, and he said, you know, there is an interesting thing about you, which you are in part a classicist, yet you work with shapes and ways that suggest, other things, that you always have, he said to me, a strong sense of proportionality. But above all, no one understands and does better with light. Take that praise and put it in some context of where you see yourself.
To see yourself, I think, is a little bit impossible. In a way, you're doing your work, you're thinking, you're trying to solve problems, and you're trying to simultaneously have an opinion in a very complex, changing world. And so I think one of the interesting things is you really don't necessarily have an opinion of yourself. You have to, in a way, it's like someone rowing a boat. You're in a way going forward, facing the past. You can see what you've done.
Yeah.
And recently, I've been interrogated out in Ohio by Jeff Kipnis. It's a little lecture series where you have to give 2 days intense everything you've done.
Right.
And it's very interesting.
And what came out of that experience?
I realized that the work has been building up, and I realized how important it is to write as well as to build. And I've been very lucky, and I've had quite a few buildings for someone theoretically involved get built. And but I'm in the middle of writing a book right now called Elastic Horizons, which is a reflecting moment, and it's really a great one because one really starts to, in a way, have an opinion and have attitudes about the things that are swirling on around you. And I think this is very important for an architect to do, to step back, to take a longer view, a larger view of everything that's changing in the society.
You think you're a better architect, this is an obvious question, because you've taken time to teach, taken time to write treatises, taken time to, to pull back from just building.
Oh, absolutely. I think, the problem with a practice is it consumes you. Buildings are very complex, and they take enormous amounts of time. And if you don't take a distance and reflect, you can get dull as an architect. And I think one of the exciting things is what we've been able to do with a few buildings, and each one, in a way, is breaking new ground. I'm very excited about our recent work right now, and I think in some ways I've just finally reached a kind of momentum to be able to put some of the thought into the buildings.
Before we look at some slides and talk about other things, someone said this to me, that you have this really remarkable way of working in which you work with watercolor renderings.
Right.
That before you even think about architectural structure, that you go into a room with canvas, watercolors.
Right. Well, it's not a canvas, it's a little watercolor pad, that I can fit on an airplane.
And what do you do there?
I'll be making conceptual sketches, but rather than just a dry diagram, they already have space and light. By the way, space is the incredible media of architecture. It's. I think if you have an intellectual idea, a verbal idea, and you have a spatial equivalence simultaneously, you're really on the road to having a scheme. But without space, you really don't have an idea. You can have an exterior form, and in the end, struggling to make an interior. And in the end, architecture, by the way, is decided when you walk into the building. Those are the places we inhabit, that we live in.
Let's say that again, architecture?
Well, so many architects work from the outside in, and I really think that this is backwards, you know, because in the end, the feeling of the building, the experiential dimensions of space, like in our Kiasma Museum in Helsinki, I was making watercolor drawings of the interiors before having an overall form on the exterior, or simultaneous to that. So this tool, this little tool, by the way, took a kind of supercharged dimension in 1991 when we computerized our office, and we could scan my watercolors in, and 10 people could be working on drawings that I would make on an airplane on the way from here or there. So that the computer has supercharged this little tool of the watercolor. It's not like a kind of retro tool.
Now, do you know anybody else that works like this, or is it?
I think there have been in history a lot of people that work with watercolor. I don't know if they've used them the way we do with the computer, scanning them in and then transforming them in ways that wasn't possible 5 years ago.
All right, let's take a look at some of these. The first thing we're going to see is the Nelson Atkins Museum in Kansas City. Before I go into a conversation of the things that you can build, we're going to see the Chapel of St. Ignatius in Seattle. We're going to see dormitories. We can libraries and museums, public buildings. What is it that you would most like to build? What kind of thing is there? I mean, do most architects now want to build museums? Do most architects want to build libraries? Do most architects want to build what?
I'm
Does that have any difference?
I'm interested in a new challenge. What's really exciting, we've done a few museums. They're very exciting because they have this dimension of public space. Right. I'm very enthusiastic about our dormitory at MIT, the chance to do a building that has to be, it has to be tough, but could be a catalyst to 350 incoming undergraduate students at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. That's very exciting.
All right,
that's a big challenge.
We'll see that. So let's start with the Nelson Atkins Museum in Kansas City. This is a concept of the project was to build an addition which would merge and organically connect the new spaces with the landscape in a way that complements existing 19, you can see it, 33 classical temple to art. Having said that, Stephen, talk about what I'm looking at.
Well, this is a competition among 6 architects, and we were given, in the brief, a very complex program, and we were given a couple of months, and we were told that we must not intrude on the south lawn. This is a great sculpture garden, this south lawn, and we were supposed to add on the north in the parking lot, and we felt that this was really wrong-headed, so we just took a risk, broke the rules, and made the experience of the new addition really a new museum that looks out onto the sculpture garden, that involves itself in the sculpture garden, and these lights that are coming up out of the landscape are supported by breathing T's, which unify structure, HVAC, and one of the nice things, they're not pure, they're impure. Some have cafes, one has offices in it. So what looks like a purist composition is very impure. I mean, one of the excitements I have is thinking about how architecture is changing and keeping up with science and thinking out how does that affect what we make and how we make it.
Is architecture changing primarily in terms of the tools you have to work with, or some intellectual breakthrough, or what?
All those things. It's changing because of the tools, but I think the way we think and feel is bound to be something, a changing ground. I mean, one of the things about this book I'm writing, Elastic Horizons, is just thinking about our world today and how developments such as the Hubble telescope and the view of the understanding of time, the understanding of let's say the confusion of the beginning of the universe. All of these things have impact on the way we make space, the way we think about space, and the way we feel about space. And I think one of the excitements about this project is that we could take such a radical approach and get a unanimous support from the jury and a unanimous vote from the trustees. So we could break the rules, we could go out of the box, we could merge with the landscape, and provide a project, I think, that's going to be a very exciting one for the public.
What kind of instructions did you have from the jury?
It was a very large program.
Oh.
There's a very, very, technical series of galleries that have to be parking, which we provide under a reflecting pond to the north.
All right, roll tape. Let me see the next one slide. Wow.
So when you arrive now, you will arrive in a forecourt that has a reflecting pond, and you can see those lenses bring light to a parking level down below. This museum is in a way the Metropolitan Museum of the Midwest. In the middle of America, people come from 200-mile radius, maybe larger, and they drive. So the arrival moment sometimes is a parking garage. So we made a very inspiring parking garage with glass lenses in the pond that bring light down below. Now there'll be two entrances, one to the left for the main museum experience, but to the right one can have a black tie entrance in the existing museum, and you can imagine on a Sunday afternoon when people are leaving the museum, a black tie event is going on, they can be coming out and going in two different ways.
Okay, the next one is the MIT residence we mentioned earlier, 350-bed dormitory with a dining hall, auditorium, another shared facility.
We started this project with criticizing their master plan. They had on Vassar Street a brick Boston, sort of wall. In the master plan, legislated, wasn't really made a rule. And I said in the interview, I said, the first thing I'm going to do is throw out your master plan.
Yeah.
I thought that would offend them, but it didn't. I came with a sketch the next morning, and I said, you really need to think about porosity, about letting Cambridgeport see through this wall and see the Charles River.
Right.
You need to think about how you could have a different approach, and that whole strip along Vassar Street could be porous. So then we came up with like 4 different buildings which were porous. Right. And this was one of them, which is a kind of sponge all over porous, and there's a number of openings that have public space.
Yes.
But every room has 9 windows. Every dormitory room will have 9 windows, 2 feet 2 inches square, all of which open. So imagine, one of the great luxuries that you can offer today as an architect, you don't get fine detail, you don't get great construction, but you can offer space, inspired space. And when you're in a dormitory room, and you're just there, you're studying, to have this wonderful feeling of, and it's we had to make the ceilings a little bit higher, 9 foot 2 inches from floor to ceiling. And each of these windows open so that the students will have natural ventilation. And by putting the structure in the outer wall, we also get a natural brise-soleil. For example, the summer sun doesn't go into the room, the winter sun goes into the room because of the angle due to the depth of the facade.
What happens to the summer sun? How is it reflected?
It's blocked because of the depth of the facade. So in those smaller windows, it's a natural shading device. It's like a passive solar wall, if you will.
Next one is the Cranbrook Institute of Science, Bloomfield Hills, winner of the 1995 AIA Design Award. Now, what is so great about this?
The project was an extension of Eliel Saarinen's 1937 building, which was a U-shaped building, and our addition was based on the concept of a strange attractor, the idea of multiple routes through space, a science concept developed by Edward Lawrence in 1963. So to make these multiple routes, we just touch the existing building, and then there are numerous ways that one can program the new space.
Is part of the challenge when you are doing something like this, an extension of it, a Saarinen project, or even in the case of the Nelson Atkins Museum, you got to make sure that whatever you design complements and doesn't overshadow. I think about this in terms of what happened at the Guggenheim and all that. Right. You've got to have a reverence for what's there.
Well, if the building is strong, and in the case of Cranbrook, the campus is very strong, and but in some ways we extended that building. It had 2 dead-end corridors, 2 galleries, the Hall of Minerals and the Hall of Man. So we blew them out in a way and made this into a new complex.
All right, let's see another picture of this. We got a nice four.
The light laboratory where we made different kinds of glass show natural phenomena of light. It changes every day. Every day is different in that room, and it's a natural exhibit. It's sun projected.
Next slide.
And this is the Garden of Science, in which we envisioned exhibits called The Story of Water, water, liquid, solid, and vapor.
All right, next slide.
And this is below the liquid passage where one sees the dancing of water in sunlight. It's interesting that these 3 things were not part of our program. They were things that we imagined, and they were funded first. In other words, they gave us a brief for a science museum. We imagined the story of water with a house of vapor and a house of ice. And it so inspired the donors that those things were funded first. The house of vapor, the house of ice, and the light laboratory were the first things that were funded for the museum.
All right, next slide.
This is the Museum of Contemporary Art in Helsinki,
Right.
which a competition we won in.
What, 93?
Yeah, and it opened in 98.
Yeah, and they got an award, National AIA Design Award, 1999. Tell me about it.
The building is based on the intertwining of two body parts of the building. You can see a kind of chiasmatic intertwining, which relates to the light. The horizontal light in Helsinki never reaches above 51 degrees, and therefore the sort of right side there in the slide you can see is like a catcher's mitt, bringing the light into the galleries. It also relates to the urban plan and the landscape in the distance, which I'm happy to say that the landscape park will be something that they were going to realize in the future, which extends all the way to Aalto's Finlandia Hall.
Next one, next slide, the same building.
So you can see the space at the entranceway and how one is drawn up into the sequence of galleries. There are 25 galleries, all of which have natural light.
And then the part of what you're doing here is, as you've said, having to do with looking at the building from the inside out, but is you're also looking for some kind of strong appeal to the senses.
Right.
Using the light and the space.
Absolutely.
To grab the sense of...
The real measure of architecture is when you walk with your body through it. And, and if you experience a number of different spatial configurations, I call it a sequence of overlapping perspectives, it's a completely different experience than a series of, just one big space or a series of... And in this particular building, there's no way to show this in photographs. You can only experience this walking through it. Like I said, 25 galleries. The last gallery is a kind of crescendo in a musical composition. You have a kind of row and a retrograde row that's played. You can't really understand it until you reach the last gallery, what was going on, how it was building up, and how the sort of release occurs. In terms of an architect's work, it's very frustrating that architecture really is just published in magazines. You see these.
No, it really, or
and
television.
it's warped by these
wide-angle
lenses to totally distort what the space is.
Right. When did you start using curved shapes? Is that for a while?
I think I've used curved shapes. I've used orthogonal shapes. Depends on the concept. I think every site and circumstance is a unique opportunity, and architecture can be inspired by anything. In this case, intertwining or a building folding in on itself really required the curved surfaces. And by the way, the doubly warped wall, the doubly warped curve in that wall was not easy to build. That was.
What's the material?
That's reglet, insulated glass plank. So it's structural glass that spans 9 meters, and it's a ruled surface as it moves along a wall that starts at 9.5 degrees and turns into a 9.5 degrees tilt in the other direction.
Next slide. There again.
That's that upper gallery you arrive at, and just behind that fold you see out to Tolonlante Bay.
Okay, now the Chapel of St. Ignatius.
This project also started with a brief.
Your hometown.
In my hometown, and we were given the charge to make this chapel, and we decided that we needed to transform the center of the campus. So we sited it right on a former street in the middle of the campus, therefore making what was once a kind of asphalt residual grid into a campus space. And we wanted the sequence to include what I call a thinking field, this pond of just 2 inches of water, which forms a kind of campus place of reflection. And
now, when did you do this? This was
when? It was designed in 1996, and it opened 1995 and 1996, and opened in spring of '97.
How many designs have you done in which you won the competition, and the building was never completed, never done? I mean, like, is it 15?
No, I think the ratio is 1 to 25. Efforts to something that's built.
It's completed.
Yeah.
1 to 25.
1 to 25.
I would drive me nuts.
Well,
it would.
But
all that energy.
Charlie, what you don't realize, though, is when you finally get to realize the space, it's so charged, and it's there. I mean, one of the things that...
What do you mean it's there? In other words, the one that you complete?
This chapel, for example, doesn't just communicate to architects, it communicates to people on campus. And I get emails and letters and and people taking their first grade class in there and making sketches and sending me back the sketches. I was in Seattle sort of 2 months after it opened, and I was buying something in a grocery store about 10 blocks from here. And I used my credit card, and she says, "Oh, you're an architect. You've got to go up and see that chapel up there at the university."
I didn't know.
You know, I mean, this kind
great.
of dimension, which cuts across, you know, the academic stuffiness. It cuts across the sort of political problems of architects, you know, control factors. That once you put a building down, it's an inspired space. It somehow has another life. And to realize just one of those, and by the way, Pierre Chareau only built a couple of buildings. I don't think you have to build so many.
I hear you. But I mean, I know that's true. And I know that I've talked to actors before who have said to me, you get a great role once every 10 years.
That's it.
You know, I mean, I'm still enjoy the other things. It's fun. I'm using my talent, but a great role comes along very rarely.
Yeah, it's true. And it takes a great client. The client has to really
well, speaking of that,
desire architecture.
Was there a competition for Bill Gates' house or not?
No.
No. What does that mean, no? I mean, you're a Seattle person. I would have thought you'd been in there lobbying hard to... No.
Well, I think
is there a story here that I don't know or should know?
Well, I really don't think it's much of a house. I mean, it could have been something, but I think it's a very ameliorating exterior.
$75 million.
I'd like to see, you know, sort of 70 million of that going to public work, personally. You know, one of the things that's happening in America now is the overly large house.
Yes.
And I think it's a very difficult commission. We're turning them down because
it's
difficult.
Because I mean, you're at the reputation now where people want you to do.
I believe you can only do so many buildings in your life anyway, with great intensity, and I'd much rather do dormitories for 350 students that are coming into MIT than a 20,000 square foot house for so many million. I think it's, you know, you have to just question why.
Yeah, but at some point you want to do one great house.
Well, we've made a house in Dallas, which I really feel is a great house. That's the Stretto House in Dallas, Texas.
So you've done your one great house then?
No, I think I have a few more in me.
All right, but I mean, it would just be very frustrating for me to go because it's, you know, so much of your time goes into, and passion and intensity, and all of a sudden, for whatever reason, beyond the architect's brilliance, it doesn't get built. Funds, conflicts, blah, 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 blah. Right?
Absolutely.
I mean, that would just be, you know. Okay, let's take another look at this chapel, because this is pretty good. What's this?
Inside, all the fixtures and furniture were designed by us, but executed by local craftsmen. So we found a steel maker, glass blowers, plasterers. It's you know, the crafts are still alive. You know, if you have a chance of getting a building that you can use them. Everything doesn't have to be sheetrock and aluminum windows in this world. You know, the concept for this building is 7 bottles of light in a stone box, and it's a kind of double entendre. Yeah. It refers to the fact that there are 60 different nationalities in this university, and therefore they're all kind of coming together in one collective place. It also refers to the liturgical aspects of the Jesuits. But we made each one a different color, and you can see here a kind of green field with a red lens. And you can actually tell the time of day and the time of year in these bottles of light.
Is this a good time for architecture?
I think it's a very interesting time for architecture. I think one of the things that's happened is, you know, at the sort of middle of the century, modernism in a way became a little dry, a little methodical, and architects produced some rather banal buildings. And of course, we had the reactionary period of postmodernism. Right? It had to happen, but it probably produced much worse in the end. I think the toll still needs to be taken.
In other words, the end result of postmodernism was worse than modernism.
I think most people would agree with that. Yeah. If you look around America, especially America, Europe didn't succumb to the whims. I think what's really exciting now is, in a way, we have a clearer slate. We have technology that allows us to do some things that the craftsmen that aren't there, you know, in a way, it makes up for it. And there's a chance to build great public space again. And I think we're seeing the sort of aspiration to do that. And that's the great things, I think, that can happen with...
Well, you're saying that there's a chance to do it because, what? Because there's a demand for the buildings?
There's also the will. I think that on the part of clients to not really recreate or repeat a sort of bad version of some historical idea, but to allow the possibility that with architectural inspiration that we could make something fresh and new and of our time. And we always, in a way, are of our time. So the excitement today is, for the first time in 25 years, I think we see clients who are willing to take that chance and to go forward. And at the Nelson Atkins Museum, I think that's something that we were totally surprised to receive a kind of unanimous support on their behalf, on what I thought was a conservative client, to do something which I think will be a great public place there in Kansas City.
Is Berlin the most exciting city architecturally today because of stuff that's going on?
For me, Berlin's a big disappointment. I think
you mean they dropped the ball? So
I think what happened, what could have happened, and what's happened are so far apart that I was there last year, and I think what could have happened is really something amazing. I think there were too many constraints, and there were bad.
Was this because of reunification and all of that?
No, I mean, for example, the whole building out of Friedrichstrasse could have occurred in a different way. The whole building out of Unter den Linden could have occurred in a different way. I think the constraints were too narrow. The idea of urbanism was too narrow. Now they realize that, and there's some more opening up. There's some interesting things happen, but I think that there could have been something really fascinating, and I think it's rather commercial and rather banal.
And finally, the much talked about Bilbao, important for architecture because of all the...
Yes, we were there over the summer, and I had seen so many photographs of it, and of course I know Frank and love him, as everyone does, and this building truly transformed that city. I'd been in Bilbao before, giving a lecture before that building was there. I knew what the site, I knew where it was going to be built, and it was just a mud flat, with some sort of container cargo things down there. So what he really did was an urban spectacle, like Sagrada Familia in Barcelona. Yeah. I mean, in a way, it's that. But for an art museum, that's something else. I mean, I saw, for example, Torque de Lipsis over here at the Dia Art Foundation, Richard Serra's great recent work. There were 3 of them. Then when they installed them in Bilbao, in that overly gigantic room, they looked like tables in a room. So
not as imposing.
No, and so one has a problem with the space for art, I think.
Well, that's just one room. No, that's just one room.
That's right. And what it does for the city is incredible, and what it does just for the sort of idea, the hope that we can make interesting architecture it's an amazing. It really is. It's an amazing project.
What it did for the city is amazing, and it also, what it says, maybe it is an urban spectacle, but what it says, and you hope, and other buildings do this, is just that this one sort of galvanized so much attention because of what it did for the city. What you hope it says, in addition, is a kind of respect for architecture as well.
Right. Right. As a catalyst.
As a catalyst.
As an urban catalyst. Yeah. And I think that's something that's very positive and should go on and can go on in our near future.
Steven Holl, thank you very much. Pleasure. Thank you for joining us. See you next time.